Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is David-Autor. I'm Ford Professor and Associate Head of the MIT Department of Economics, and also the co-chair of the MIT Task Force on the Work of the Future. I want to thank the audience in Austria and Europe for attending, the MIT Vienna virtual conference hosted by the Austrian Federal Economic Chamber. And I'm here to speak about the nature of work after the COVID crisis. And my thesis is that there will be too few low-wage jobs. I want to talk first about telepresence as automation. I want to talk first about telepresence as automation. The phrase telepresence actually goes back to my MIT colleague, who is one of my co-chairs on the Work of the Future Task Force, David Mindell, who famously observed that telepresence is a form of automation. Telepresence means being somewhere remotely, virtually, but not physically. When Mindell originally made this remark, he was talking about underwater drones, aka unmanned submarines, a technology that he helped pioneered and which is pictured here. But the point applies actually quite broadly. Placing people at the bottom of the sea, in Earth's upper atmosphere, at a bomb disposal site, or in any physically hostile environment entails costly, energy-intensive life support systems that provide climate control, water delivery, etc. By reducing these needs, telepresence not only reduces costs, but also typically makes for better functionality. Machines unencumbered by physically present operators can accomplish tasks that would be perilous with humans aboard. Now, these same lessons apply to workplaces. Though most workplaces are not overtly hostile to human life, they are expensive, duplicative places for performing tasks that many employees could presently accomplish from elsewhere, albeit with a loss of important social aspects of work. But not only is providing and maintaining physical offices costly for employers, it's expensive for employees. The US Census Bureau estimates that US workers spend an average of 225 hours per year commuting. That's a lot of time. Arguably, many of us who perform knowledge work have been so accustomed to the habit of being there that we fail to notice the rapid improvements in the next best alternative, which is not being there. So in thinking forward, I think we're going to see, and I don't think this is controversial any longer, a permanent shift towards greater telepresence, working from home, distance medicine, remote learning. And this is a breakthrough, but it's not in some sense a technological breakthrough. The technology for telepresence has been improving for more than 20 years since the introduction of Skype, for example. My co-authors and I actually have been using Zoom for a number of years to collaborate internationally. I have a big TV screen on my wall, and I often have several co-authors there. So the technology was around. The coordination problem is that the technology is only useful to me if other people are using it as well. If you think back to the turn of the 20th century, I didn't want to buy a home telephone unless you also had a home telephone, and all the people I wanted to speak with would also have a home telephone. We all needed to agree that we would use this technology to communicate with one another, and then in some ways it could be a substitute for showing up at someone's house or going to a meeting. And so by causing us all to move into this domain simultaneously, we've also increased the benefits, reduced the costs, and changed the social norm. This would have happened. This truly would have happened over the next decade or so. The pandemic has just brought this event closer into the present. But it's important to notice that the benefits of this change in communications modality, and there are many benefits, will be highly unequally distributed. All workers would like to work from home, but employer acceptance of working from home is much greater for high-wage workers, as I'll show in a moment. But first, why does that matter? Well, actually, let me show this slide first as I'm speaking to the camera now, and then I will show the other slide previously. This will require a little bit of editing. So employer acceptance of work from home will be much greater for high-wage workers. How do we know this? Well, here's a figure by a recent survey paper by Bararo, Bloom, and Davis, and they asked people, how many days per week would you like to spend working from home after the pandemic is over? The red triangles refer to the preferences of the black circles refer to the preferences of workers. And you can see that just about everybody, regardless of their annual earnings levels in US dollars, between 20,000 and 250,000, basically wants to work 2 to 2.5 days per week from home. However, if you look at employer plans, those are the orange triangles, you'll see that those are strongly increasing in workers' wage levels. In other words, higher wage workers will be permitted more often to work from home. And that's understandable, perhaps. One, they have a lot more discretion in what they do. They're often supervised less. And two, maybe much more what more of the work they do can be delivered remotely. Why does this matter? Well, if you look at the way people spend money, when people go to work, when they commute to work, they spend money near work. They spend money at gas stations, at coffee shops, at restaurants. After work, they go out to bars or take clients out to dinners. If you look at how much people report spending per week near their work, you'll see that is strongly increasing in the density of places where they work. So on the left side of this figure is people who work in suburban areas. On the right side of figure are people who work in high density urban areas. And you can see that expenditures are strongly increasing in the density where you work. If you work in downtown Manhattan, you might be spending $300 a week. If you work in a local suburb, you might be spending $100 a week or less. Well, if we look at what employers' plans are for people working from home, they expect people who work in dense areas to be spending more of their days per year working from home. For example, in the most dense places, employers are anticipating about 35% of days spent working from home, so a third. But that's a big deal. So these are people going to expensive, dense downtown areas, previously spending a considerable amount of money there, and now they'll be doing less of that. Well, why that matters, of course, is that there's a whole ecosystem of workers and services that are meant to receive those expenditures, to provide the food, to provide the accommodations, to provide the security and the cleaning services, and so on for that commuter economy. So that's obviously going to have a larger effect on dense, high-priced urban areas relative to other places. Now, that will be compounded by another phenomenon, which is a change in business travel. We'll be doing less of it, less than we would have, maybe not less in absolute terms. The Wall Street Journal, for example, projected in December of last year that the COVID pandemic could cut business travel by about a third permanently. Why is that? Well, I think it's self-evident, but let's just review. One, of course, business travel has lots of out-of-pocket outlays, hotels and plane tickets and food and so on. But arguably an even larger expense is that many of the people who are doing the business travel are highly paid individuals who have a lot of work to do, and they spend a fair amount of unproductive time sitting on airplanes or in airports or getting, packing and unpacking at hotels. So they'll be doing less of that. You will just see fewer people crossing continents for 90-minute meetings that they could do telepresently. Why is that consequential? Well, again, same phenomenon. It's going to change the density of movement into and out of marquee places, out of expensive cities, out of Vienna, out of Paris, out of London, out of Sydney and Perth, out of New York and Los Angeles. And that, again, is going to affect work in those places. Business travelers don't just buy air tickets. They also buy Uber trips and limousine trips and taxi trips. They stay at expensive hotels on weeknights and pay full rates. They go out to expensive restaurants and put the money on the company tab, or to bars. They get laundry services and dry cleaning and shoe shines and go shopping. All of that, they'll be doing less of that. And that's going to place downward pressure on employment in many of these services in dense urban areas. And let me say there's even an additionally profound challenge, not just simply employment, but if you think about the travel and hospitality industry, it's unusual in that it's kind of a dual customer model. On the one hand, you have business travelers who typically, buy business class fares. They stay at these expensive hotels on weeknights. They go out to the expensive restaurants on weeknights. Then you often have leisure travelers who typically are a little stingier or a little more frugal. They're flying economy class. They're staying at hotels on weekends when they're often somewhat cheaper. They're going out to less expensive meals, but they're doing these on different days of the week, and they're arguably complementary. Business class travelers are arguably paying average cost at hotels and on airplanes, and leisure travelers are arguably paying marginal costs. So the marginal cost of an empty airplane seat, the marginal cost of an empty hotel room overnight, those are very low. But the average cost of those things is not low. And so if the weight of business travel in the entire leisure, hospitality, travel economy declines, what that means is that's going to require a reconfiguration of the business model of those services. They're going to actually have to find a way to get more from leisure travelers and less from business travelers, and to rebalance those average costs across customers. So that's going to be a difficult and painful transition for those businesses. But let me return to the subject of low-wage jobs and point out a fourth phenomenon, which is automation forcing. The COVID crisis has caused employers to have to deal with a shortage of in-person workers in many activities. As in so many other things, necessity is the mother of invention. This shortage of workers causes firms to innovate, to look for ways to resolve the problems that face them. We see many examples of what we call automation forcing. By automation forcing, I mean adapting, adopting, purchasing, figuring out how to use technologies, but it's not necessarily the case that those technologies didn't exist, but they weren't being used in this way, and it wasn't necessarily economical to use them this way, but all of a sudden the pandemic made it economical to do so. So examples might include drones delivering medical supplies, or warehouse disinfecting robots, as this is an example of an MIT warehouse disinfecting robot that goes around spraying things with a disinfectant, or drones that check the temperatures on people's forehead, labor-saving reorganizations of firms to use less workers and more machines to do what they were already doing. Or a really interesting example is the meatpacking industry. As many of you have heard in the United States, at least, it was a public health disaster in the meatpacking sector. Workers are working extremely in close proximity, a very germ-intensive, sweat-intensive environment, and the rate of COVID infection was extremely high. And there were many adverse health events. As a consequence of this crisis in meatpacking, firms have accelerated the process of adapting robotics for meat processing. Now, robotics is not well suited to meatpacking. The reason is that cutting meat off a bone requires adaptively dealing with inconsistent soft materials, something robots are not good at. And the stakes are very high. If you cut too little meat off the bone, well, you waste valuable material. If you cut too close to the bone, you get bone in the product, which is also a very undesirable thing to do. So this is not a natural application. This is not like installing windshields on cars or assembling repetitive parts. This calls heavily on human dexterity. But there's no question that the process of robotics, once it starts in meatpacking, will not reverse. And so what the crisis has done is it's brought this technology from the future into the present faster than would otherwise have occurred. So let me now put this in perspective. If you look in the US, and in fact, in many advanced economies, over the last 20 to 30 years, employment growth has been kind of a barbell. What I mean by a barbell is simultaneous growth of low-paid personal service jobs, food service, cleaning, protective services, and growth of high-paid professional, technical, and managerial jobs, so a lot of poundage on either end of the bar, and a decline in production and labor and office administrative and sales occupations. What's going on in the middle there is not mysterious. Many of those things can increasingly be done by software accomplished by computers, so fewer workers are needed to do them. Whereas the professional jobs and many of these personal service jobs require either cognitive dexterity or physical dexterity and adaptability that have been difficult to simulate with machinery. So that's why we get this barbell, or that's an important contributor to that barbell. You see the same if you look across many European economies. This figure shows you from a paper by Martin Goose. This is a paper from a paper by Martin Goose, Alan Manning, and Anna Solomons from 2014. And they show the change in the structure of employment in a number of EU economies. And you see that those red bars are the decline in the middle, and the green and blue are the growth in both high wage, high education, and low wage, low education employment. Well, that's consequential. The leisure and hospitality sector alone account for, in the US, for almost 17 million jobs in 2019. That was about more than 1 in 10 jobs. Many of those are those low-paid jobs I'm speaking about here. But as the demand for workers in middle-skill production, clerical, administrative support occupations has eroded in the face of automation, this barbell has become increasingly prevalent. But now, and sorry, I'm going to just pause here. This barbell has become increasingly prevalent. So now I'm going to add another point to that. Apologize. This and I'll say not only has this barbell become visible in many countries, it's also particularly an urban phenomenon. If you look at the work done by people without a formal tertiary 4-year college degree in the United States, done in low pay, medium pay, and high pay work. If you look at this middle section, the share of non-college workers doing medium pay work used to be steeply increasing in urban areas. It was much higher in cities than in suburbs or rural areas. And that has been declining over decades between 1980 and 2015. And what has been rising instead is low-paid non-college workers are increasingly found in low-paid services, transportation, construction, and labor jobs. That's this upper line here. And so when we talk about the potential decline in demand for many of these personal services, and they're particularly concentrated in cities, well, that's exactly where employment for low-paid workers has been growing. So if demand for personal and business services is permanently diminished in the post-COVID labor market, this will in effect mean that weight is sliding off the low-wage end of the barbell. And these challenges will be compounded by the already unfolding wave of major retail bankruptcies. In 2019, retail sales employment accounted for about 4% of employment. These are typically low-paid jobs, but now we will have fewer of them. And you can see that in this figure. If we look at the trend in employment in professional and business services or retail and transportation, those have mostly come back. But in leisure and hospitality, those are still down almost a third from the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020. So those jobs have not bounced back. Now, of course, you might say, well, they will as soon as the pandemic ends, and that's possible. Certainly, they won't remain depressed by 28%. They will, on the other hand, I do not think, return to their initial level because of the change in the way people will commute, the change in the way they will travel, the change in the way that they will do their work. So let me sort of wrap up and try to summarize what I've said. After the crisis, we're going to be facing what I think of as too few low-wage jobs. Now, let me say, this pandemic will moderate. It will not reverse the economic trends of the past 30 years. Reports of the death of cities have been greatly exaggerated over many decades, even as popular commentators have opined that the internet has rendered the world economically flat. Leading indicators have pointed in just the opposite direction. Rising urban rents, corporations relocating their headquarters to expensive marquee locations and more affordable cities, and the weight of GDP in many countries shifting towards their kind of superstar and premier cities. So I don't think the COVID pandemic is going to reverse that. I think it's going to decelerate it. It's going to moderate rather than reverse these trends. And this moderation could have benefits. Cities may become less hectic, more affordable, and ultimately more family-friendly. So there are good things that come from that. But the challenge is that there is adjustment. Making these adjustments, and the benefits will flow heavily towards highly paid, highly educated workers who will be able to commute from their homes, telecommute from their homes, and do their work more effectively. And the adjustment costs will fall much more heavily on the workers who are in some sense there to serve the comfort, the convenience, and the health of those high paid individuals in the places that they choose to do their work. So there will be less poundage on the low wage end of the barbell economy. There will be long-term reductions in office occupancy and commuting, and this will affect the economic structure of urban life. And as I said, the disruptions will fall heavily on low-paid workers in personal service occupations. Now, you might ask, well, isn't this good news? After all, low-paid jobs aren't necessarily good jobs, and now we have fewer of them. Isn't that a benefit to have less of a not very good thing? And unfortunately, the answer is no. Decline in low-wage work will not raise demand for middle-paid work. In fact, the recession is already over, at least in the United States, for middle and high-paid workers, but not for low-paid service workers. And so one of the benefits that we saw over the last 5 years in the US and throughout the industrialized world was tight labor markets, low rates of unemployment, rising employment to population ratios among people with lower educations, among people with criminal histories, among people with physical work limitations. Tight labor markets generate lots of benefits, but those benefits accrue very strongly to people towards the bottom, the people who are kind of first to be fired, last to be hired. And now we're entering a period of slack labor demand, particularly for people in low-paid work. In the best case scenario, the COVID recovery will feature a sharp snapback across all sectors and a return to the high-pressure labor markets of the late 2010s. Alternatively, if sectors such as hospitality, building services, transportation end up permanently diminished, then current slack labor markets will take additional years to work off, and the macroeconomic benefits of tight labor markets will take longer to return. Thanks very much for your interest, and I welcome your questions.
Well, thank you, Professor Autor. And now some questions from our virtual audience. First question, will the changes in the way that we work post-COVID, particularly the rise of telepresence and the accompanying decline in weekly commuting and frequent business travel, ultimately boost productivity?
Is this good for productivity? And the answer, I think, in the long run is yes, it is good for productivity because we're going to be cutting out a lot of cost, time spent in commuting, time spent in business travel, and also improving the ease with which people can collaborate and reducing some of those frictions. Now, there are costs as well. Clearly, there are benefits to being in the office. There are benefits to working side by side with people, and that's been true for a long time. We don't know how much the pandemic or the technology we've become used to using now have moved that needle. But I think they move it some way. They free some constraints. It just in net has to allow us to work more efficiently and in some sense more pleasantly. I think many people have discovered that yes, there are burdens to the pandemic when you don't have childcare, when schools are closed, when restaurants are closed. On the other hand, we've also discovered that it's kind of nice to be with families rather than leaving our houses at the crack of dawn and coming back in the early evening. And so there are both productivity benefits and personal well-being benefits that potentially come from a change in our working lives.
A second question from our audience, what about agglomeration?
What about the benefits of cities? There's a reason that people are clustered so tightly, paying such high rents, and that's absolutely correct. Cities are more productive for a variety of reasons we don't fully understand, but have been known about for quite a while. When people work closely together, they tend to be more creative. They tend to be more dynamic. This is where kind of the spillovers from knowledge and expertise and creativity happen most intensively when people are clustered together. And certainly, I do not think that the pandemic is going to reverse all that. It's not going to cause cities to empty out. It's not going to cause it, everybody to move to the mountains or something like that. However, it's going to, in my opinion, it's going to moderate those forces. It's going to allow that to be less of a constraint, less of a necessity. And there are many good things that could come from that. I don't know how many of you have been to Silicon Valley, But that's a super expensive place. People are paying, $1 million to purchase a garage somewhere. And it's not necessarily the most desirable place to live. People are living in Silicon Valley, not because it's naturally beautiful or so incredibly attractive, because they feel like that's where they have to be to do the work they want to do. Their work is less valuable if they don't do it there. And maybe that will change a bit. And if that does, that can lead to a different use of space. It can also lead to a different geographic distribution of productivity and income. In many ways, that might be beneficial. In the United States, where so much of GDP, so much of wealth is increasingly concentrated in a small number of marquee locations, having some deconcentration could have not only economic benefits, but political benefits in terms of the kind of geographic, economic, and political polarization of the country.
And a third question from our audience: will our new mode of interacting through telepresence change the way we structure education?
I think the answer is absolutely and inevitably yes. For a long time, the structure of universities, and in fact, all education, has been driven by a model of the need for proximity. We need to have the place where the teachers and the students and the books and the labs are all clustered together because they can't be physically separated. We all know that's been a growing fiction for the last couple of decades. Many of us access most of our books or reference materials electronically. Many of us communicate with students via phone or via Zoom. But now the whole fiction that the number of students that can be served by an educational institution is limited by the physical size of the institution, the number of dormitories it has, that fiction is no longer remotely credible. We're going to have to think about how to organize education differently, because we have been missing out on so much of the public good aspects. If someone's a great lecturer, those lectures could become more broadly available. If teaching materials are terrific, why have everybody replicate their own? Why not share more of them? Now, education requires a lot of human contact. It requires a lot of guidance. It requires a lot of encouragement. It's not that we can eliminate the labor or the expertise or the social aspects of education, but we can change the allocation of labor, less replication of the kind of part of distributing information, and more investment in the part of counseling and supporting students wherever they are. So I'm actually optimistic that the removal of physical proximity constraints will improve the way we teach, and more than that, improve accessibility to education. It will make it more affordable, more convenient, and ultimately more engaging and more equitable, more accessible to people throughout the world who don't just have to benefit from who knows them or where they went to school, but will be able to demonstrate their expertise and get access to education, access to skills, access to expertise based on interest, based on merit, based on capacity, based on need. Okay, thank you so much for your questions. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. I appreciate your inviting me to the MIT Vienna conference, and I wish you an enjoyable and educational, engaging remainder of the events.